She had 48 hours, 250 cattle dying of thirst, a bank ready to steal everything her grandfather built, and a blizzard tearing her world apart. Then she found a man half buried in the snow, bleeding, broken, left for dead. She didn't know that saving him would cost her everything she had left, and that losing everything would be the only way she'd finally find what she was fighting for. This story reminds us of something we all forget when we're exhausted and alone. True strength isn't refusing help. It's having the courage to trust the right person with your heaviest burden. Welcome to a place where the wind tells hard truths. This channel is home to stories of rugged cowboys and unbreakable women, of love forged in fire. If that hits something real inside you, drop a comment, share, and hit subscribe. Now settle in. This one's worth every minute.
The foreclosure notice snapped in Lena Whitaker's cracked, freezing hands. The sound was as sharp and violent as the blizzard currently ripping the roof off her last good hay barn. Lena stood in the center of the muddy yard. The wind howled down from the Montana mountains, carrying ice that bit into her face like shattered glass. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero just past noon. It was the kind of cold that stole the breath straight from a person's lungs. But Lena did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the crumpled piece of heavy paper in her grip. The bold black letters printed at the top of the page offered no warmth and no mercy. The bank was giving her exactly 30 days. After 30 days, the Whitaker Ranch, a legacy that had stood in Red Hollow for 3 generations, would no longer belong to her. Above her, a rusted sheet of corrugated metal tore loose from the barn roof. The metal shrieked against the iron nails. Lena looked up just as the wind caught the metal panel, sending it spinning into the white-out conditions of the pasture. She felt a heavy, sinking weight in her chest. That roof had sheltered her father's horses for 40 years. Now the old wooden beams were exposed to the brutal winter storm, rotting a little more with every passing second. Lena folded the foreclosure notice. Her hands shook, but not entirely from the cold. She shoved the paper deep into the pocket of her canvas work coat. The coat was 5 years old. The seams at the shoulders were fraying, and the original brown color had faded into a dull, dusty gray. Her leather work boots were worn down at the heels. Her thick gloves had holes in the thumbs, letting the freezing air bite directly into her skin. She was exhausted. Her bones ached with a deep, persistent pain that came from working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Since her father died 2 years ago, Lena had carried the entire weight of the ranch on her own shoulders. She refused to hire help she could not afford. She refused to accept charity from the neighboring ranchers. She had built a fortress of pride around herself, convinced that absolute independence was the only way to survive. But independence could not stop a blizzard, and pride could not pay a mortgage. Lena turned her back to the ruined barn and leaned into the wind. She needed to check the south pasture. The storm had started 6 hours ago, and she knew the cattle would be huddling near the tree line for shelter. More importantly, she needed to check the main livestock well. Every step through the snow was a physical battle. The drifts were already 2 feet deep in some places. The icy wind pushed against her chest, trying to knock her backward. Lena kept her head down. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The muscles in her thighs burned. The cold air seared her throat with every breath. The geography of Red Hollow was beautiful in the summer, but it was a ruthless killer in the winter. The valley was surrounded by steep limestone cliffs and dotted with abandoned silver mines. Beneath the frozen ground ran a complex network of underground rivers and caves. Lena knew this land better than anyone. When she was 10 years old, her grandfather had taught her how to map the subterranean water flows. She knew every dip, every ridge, and every hidden spring on her 500 acres. Finally, she reached the fence line of the south pasture. Through the swirling white snow, she saw them. There were 250 head of Angus cattle pressed tightly together beneath the bare branches of the cottonwood trees. Their dark coats were covered in a layer of white frost. Thick clouds of steam rose from their noses as they breathed in the freezing air. Lena felt a sharp pang of worry. They were surviving the cold for now, but they needed fuel to keep their body heat up. They needed hay and they needed fresh water. She pushed through the heavy wooden gate and walked toward the large steel water trough. Usually she could hear the steady, rhythmic hum of the electric pump drawing water up from the deep underground aquifer. Today the sound was different. The pump was screaming. It was a harsh, grinding noise of metal scraping against metal. Lena broke into a heavy run. The snow dragged at her boots, but she forced herself to move faster. She reached the steel trough and looked inside. It was completely empty. A thin layer of ice coated the bottom of the steel tank, but there was no water flowing from the thick PVC pipe. The pump motor, housed in a wooden box next to the trough, vibrated violently. It sounded like it was tearing itself apart. Lena ripped off her right glove. She needed to feel the equipment. Her bare hand clamped down on the freezing metal casing of the pump pipe. The cold immediately burned her skin, but she ignored the pain. She closed her eyes and focused all her senses on the vibration of the pipe. When a pipe was frozen solid, it felt dead and heavy. When water was flowing, there was a distinct, smooth vibration of liquid rushing upward. Right now, Lena felt a hollow, dry rattling. The motor was running at full capacity, sucking desperately at the earth below. But it was pulling up nothing but empty air. "No," Lena whispered. Her voice was snatched away by the howling wind. "No, no, no, not today." She dropped to her knees in the snow. She fumbled with the metal latches on the wooden pump house. Her stiff, numb fingers struggled to grip the cold metal. Finally, she popped the latches and threw the heavy wooden lid open. The electric motor was smoking. The smell of burning rubber and hot oil hit her face. Lena quickly reached out and slammed the heavy red power switch downward. The screaming noise died instantly. The sudden silence in the pasture was terrifying, broken only by the relentless whistling of the blizzard. Lena stayed on her knees. She stared at the silent, smoking motor. Her mind raced through the possibilities. It was not a frozen pipe. It was not a broken electrical relay. The water table had dropped. The well was completely dry. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her chest. It was a completely different kind of cold than the winter storm. This was the cold of absolute ruin. A ranch could survive a broken barn. A ranch could even survive a late bank payment if the owner begged hard enough. But a cattle ranch could not survive without water. She had 250 head of cattle. In this extreme winter weather, their bodies required massive amounts of calories and hydration just to shiver and stay alive. Without water, their digestive systems would shut down. They would not be able to process the dry hay. They would be dead in exactly 48 hours. Lena stood up slowly. Her knees cracked in the cold. She looked at the huddled mass of black cattle. They were her livelihood. They were the last remaining piece of the empire her father had tried so hard to build. If they died, the bank would not even need 30 days. The ranch would be over by the weekend. She put her torn glove back onto her freezing hand. She refused to cry. Tears would just freeze on her eyelashes anyway. Crying was a useless waste of energy, and she needed every ounce of energy she had left. She turned away from the empty water trough and began the long, brutal walk back to the main cabin. The journey back felt twice as long. The wind was blowing directly into her face now. The snow stung her cheeks and blinded her vision. She kept her eyes focused on the faint yellow porch light shining through the storm. That single bulb was the only beacon of warmth in a world that felt like it was ending. Lena reached the wooden porch of the cabin. She stomped the heavy snow off her boots. Her legs felt like blocks of cement. She grabbed the brass handle of the front door, pushed it open, and quickly slipped inside, slamming the heavy oak door shut against the storm. The sudden quiet inside the cabin was a relief, but the temperature was not. The thermostat on the wall read 42 degrees. The fire in the wood stove had died down to a few glowing embers while she was outside. Lena did not take off her coat. She walked straight to the cast-iron stove in the corner of the living room. She grabbed 3 thick logs from the indoor woodpile and tossed them inside the metal box. She used an iron poker to stir the embers, blowing gently until a small orange flame caught the dry bark. She watched the fire grow, waiting until the heat began to radiate outward. Only then did she slowly peel off her wet gloves and her heavy canvas coat. She hung the coat on a wooden peg by the door. She kicked off her frozen boots and walked into the kitchen in her thick wool socks. The cabin was small and purely functional. The furniture was old and worn. The kitchen table was covered in stacks of unpaid bills, geological maps, and a calculator. Lena walked to the table and picked up the foreclosure notice she had shoved into her pocket earlier. She smoothed out the wrinkled paper and placed it flat in the center of the table. She stared at the numbers. She owed the bank $45,000. She had exactly $800 in her checking account. Her fingers, still burning with the painful sensation of blood returning to cold tissue, reached for the black telephone on the kitchen counter. She picked up the heavy plastic receiver and dialed the direct number for the agricultural loan office in town. The phone rang 3 times. Finally, a man answered. "Red Hollow County Bank. This is Thomas Harris," the man said. His voice was smooth, warm, and entirely comfortable inside a heated office building. "Mr. Harris, this is Lena Whitaker," Lena said. Her voice was rough and raspy from the cold air. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Lena could hear the sound of a computer keyboard clicking. "Ah, Miss Whitaker," Harris said. His tone shifted. The professional warmth vanished, replaced by a tight, practiced corporate courtesy. "I assume you received the notice we mailed out this week." "I am looking at it right now," Lena said. "You gave me 30 days. "That is the standard legal timeline for a final notice," Harris replied. "Miss Whitaker, we have tried to work with you. You have missed the last 4 payments. We extended your grace period twice. The bank simply cannot carry this debt any longer. The board has made their decision." "I am not asking for another extension," Lena said. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter tightly. "I am telling you that I will have the money before the 30 days are up. Do not send any surveyors or agents to my property. You do not have the legal right to step onto my land until day 31. Harris sighed heavily into the phone. It was a sound that conveyed deep pity, and Lena hated him for it. "Miss Whitaker, please be realistic," Harris said. "The cattle market is down. You are running that massive property completely alone. There is no shame in admitting that the burden is too heavy. We have a buyer interested in the land right now. A corporate developer named Victor Callahan. He is willing to pay a fair price. If you sell to him voluntarily today, you can walk away with some cash in your pocket. If you let the bank foreclose next month, you will walk away with absolutely nothing." The name Victor Callahan sent a spike of pure anger through Lena's exhausted body. Callahan had been circling the Red Hollow Valley for 6 months like a vulture. He was buying up failing ranches, tearing down the historic homes, and preparing the land for luxury resorts and corporate water extraction. "My father built this ranch with his own 2 hands, Lena said. Her voice was low and dangerous. "I am not selling it to a corporate vulture so he can pave over my grazing land, and I am not surrendering it to your bank." "You have 30 days, Miss Whitaker," Harris said coldly. "After that, it is no longer your decision." The line went dead. Lena slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. She stood in the quiet kitchen. The fire in the living room was finally beginning to warm the air, but Lena still felt entirely frozen inside. She walked over to the large geological map pinned to the wooden wall of the living room. It was a map her grandfather had drawn by hand 50 years ago. It detailed the entire Red Hollow Valley. It showed the high ridges, the deep canyons, and most importantly, the hidden underground water system. She traced her finger along the blue line that represented the main aquifer. The water flowed down from the northern mountains, passed deep beneath her property, and continued south. Why had her well gone dry? It did not make sense. Winter droughts were rare, and the underground aquifer was fed by deep mountain springs that never froze completely. For a well that deep to pull pure air, the water table had to have dropped by at least 50 feet in a matter of days. That was not a natural occurrence. That was a mechanical failure, or worse, human interference. Lena closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the cool paper of the map. She was surrounded by enemies. The bank was squeezing her from the outside. The brutal winter storm was freezing her from above. And now, the very earth below her feet was refusing to give her the water she needed to keep her cattle alive. She had 48 hours to fix a dry well in the middle of a blizzard. A quiet, insidious voice whispered in the back of her mind. It was the voice of fear. It told her that Harris was right. It told her that she was not strong enough, not smart enough, and not tough enough to carry this legacy. It told her that she had failed her father. Lena opened her eyes and pushed herself away from the wall. "No," she said out loud to the empty room. She walked over to the heavy oak dining table. She grabbed a thick black marker and wrote a large number, 48, on the back of a blank envelope. She stared at the number. It was a countdown. She would not let the cattle die. She would not let the bank take the land. She would figure out a way to get water out of the ground tomorrow, even if she had to dig through the frozen earth with her bare hands. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The blizzard was raging harder now. The snow was a solid white wall, completely blocking out the lights of the neighboring properties. Directly to the east, across 5 miles of rugged ridgeline, lay the Maddox Ranch. It was the largest and most successful operation in the county. Lena knew that somewhere in that direction, Cole Maddox was sitting in a warm, massive house, completely untouched by the desperation that was tearing her apart. Cole Maddox was the golden boy of Red Hollow. Every woman in town wanted his attention, and every man wanted his success. He was tall, intimidating, and kept a cold, polite distance from everyone. He never asked for help, and he never offered it. Lena hated him a little bit for his perfection. She hated that his fences were always straight, his cattle were always fat, and his barns never lost their roofs in a storm. She had not spoken a single word to Cole Maddox in 3 years. She intended to keep it that way. She did not need a savior. And she certainly did not need a rich, arrogant cowboy looking down on her failing ranch with pity in his eyes. She turned away from the window and pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the storm and the rest of the world. Lena walked back to the kitchen table. She picked up a heavy steel flashlight, a thick leather tool belt, and a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. She laid them out in a neat row. Tomorrow morning, at first light, she would take her truck down to the old silver mines on the edge of her property. There was a natural surface spring near the main cave entrance. If the water table had dropped, that deep spring might still have a pool of liquid water at the bottom. She would have to haul it up by hand, bucket by bucket, 10 gallons at a time to keep the herd alive. It was a back-breaking, impossible plan. It would take every ounce of physical strength she possessed. Lena walked to the stove and held her scarred, calloused hands out toward the heat of the fire. The skin was red and raw. The knuckles were permanently swollen from years of hard labor. They were not pretty hands. They were the hands of a fighter. She looked at the foreclosure notice one last time. "You want a fight," Lena whispered to the paper. "Then you better bring a bigger storm." She turned off the kitchen light. The cabin plunged into darkness, lit only by the flickering orange glow of the wood stove. Outside, the wind screamed, tearing at the wooden walls of the cabin, trying desperately to find a way inside. But the walls held firm. Lena Whitaker lay down on the small couch near the fire. She pulled a thick wool blanket over her shoulders. She did not sleep. She lay awake in the dark, listening to the destruction outside, counting the hours until the sun would rise. She was alone. She was exhausted, and she was trapped. But she was not broken yet. The war for the Whitaker Ranch had just begun. The morning sun did not bring any light to Red Hollow. It only turned the black sky into a harsh, blinding gray. The blizzard had not stopped. The wind was still screaming across the valley at 50 miles per hour, packing the snow into massive frozen walls. Lena Whitaker had been awake since 4 in the morning. She drank 1 cup of bitter black coffee, put her damp canvas coat back on, and walked out into the storm. Her 48-hour countdown was ticking. She started the engine of her 15-year-old Ford truck. The engine whined and coughed, fighting the bitter cold before finally roaring to life. The heater in the truck was broken. Lena shivered violently as she gripped the freezing steering wheel. She threw the truck into gear and drove slowly toward the eastern ridge. The eastern ridge was the highest point on her property. It formed the border between the Whitaker Ranch and the massive Maddox Ranch. At the base of this ridge sat the old silver mine entrances and the natural surface springs. The drive took 40 minutes. The snow was incredibly deep. Lena had to force the truck through thick drifts, the tires spinning and sliding on the hidden ice below. She parked the truck near a cluster of dead pine trees. She grabbed 2 heavy plastic buckets and a coil of thick nylon rope from the truck bed. The wind up on the ridge was brutal. It ripped at her clothes and threw sharp ice into her eyes. Lena tied one end of the rope around her waist and the other end to the bumper of the truck. The ground near the mine entrances was steep and slippery. If she fell into the canyon, the rope was her only chance of climbing back up. She walked toward the dark, jagged opening of the old mine. The entrance was partially blocked by snow, but a narrow path led downward into the rock. Inside the cave, the air was surprisingly still, but the cold was deeper. It smelled of wet stone and old earth. Lena found the surface, spring. It was a small pool of dark water sitting in a depression of limestone. A thick layer of ice covered the top. Lena raised her heavy metal flashlight and smashed the heavy handle down onto the ice. The ice cracked and broke apart. She dropped the first plastic bucket into the freezing water. The bucket filled up, becoming incredibly heavy. Lena gripped the plastic handle and pulled it out. Her back muscles screamed in protest. 10 gallons of water weighed over 80 pounds. She had 250 cows. 2 buckets would barely keep 3 cows alive for a day. This plan was impossible. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She could not haul enough water by hand to save the herd. Lena carried the heavy bucket back out into the screaming blizzard. She dumped the water into a large plastic tank in the back of her truck. She turned around to go back into the cave. That was when she saw it. Through the thick, swirling snow, about 100 yards down the fence line, a wooden post was leaning at a sharp angle. The barbed wire connecting it to the next post was hanging loose, snapping wildly in the wind. Lena dropped her empty bucket. A broken fence meant the cattle could wander onto the highway and freeze to death. She unclipped the safety rope from her waist and started walking toward the broken post. The snow was up to her knees. Every step was a battle. As she got closer, she saw that the wooden post had not been blown over by the wind. It had been cut. Lena stared at the thick wire. The ends were clipped clean. Only heavy-duty steel bolt cutters could make a cut like that. Someone had intentionally destroyed the boundary line between her property and the Maddox Ranch. She took another step forward. Her boot hit something hard buried beneath the snow. It was not a rock. It was a metal crowbar. Lena looked down. A dark red stain was spreading across the pure white snow. The color was shocking. It was fresh blood. Lena followed the trail of red drops. They led away from the fence toward a deep snowdrift near a cluster of large boulders. Her heart pounded in her chest. She gripped her heavy metal flashlight tightly, holding it like a weapon. She rounded the edge of the boulder. A man was lying face down in the snow. He was massive. His broad shoulders were covered in a dark leather jacket that was ripped and torn. He was not moving. The snow was quickly covering his body, burying him alive. Lena dropped to her knees. She grabbed the man by his heavy leather shoulder and pulled hard. He was dead weight, incredibly heavy. Lena planted her boots in the snow, gritted her teeth, and rolled him onto his back. It was Cole Maddox. The golden boy of Red Hollow was broken. His face was covered in blood. A deep, ugly gash ran across his forehead. His right eye was swollen completely shut. His lips were split and turning a dangerous shade of blue. "Cole," Lena said. Her voice was loud and sharp over the wind. He did not answer. His chest was barely moving. Lena pulled her right glove off with her teeth. She pressed her bare fingers against the side of his neck. His skin was like ice, but she felt a pulse. It was slow and weak. She looked at his hands. His knuckles were busted open and bleeding freely. He had not just been attacked. He had fought back. He had fought hard. Cole Maddox had caught the men cutting the fence. He had fought them alone in the middle of a blizzard, and they had left him here to die. Lena felt a sudden, fierce surge of adrenaline. Cole was her neighbor. He was arrogant, he was distant, and he never spoke to her, but he was a rancher. And out here in the wild, you did not let a neighbor freeze to death in the snow. "Wake up!" Lena shouted. She slapped his cold cheek hard. Cole let out a low, ragged groan. His good eye fluttered open. The dark brown iris was unfocused. He looked up at Lena, but he did not seem to know who she was. "Get up," Lena said. "You are freezing to death. You have to stand up." "4," Cole mumbled. His voice was thick and slurred. "There were 4 of them." "I do not care if there were 40 of them," Lena said. She grabbed the collar of his heavy jacket. "I cannot carry you. You weigh 200 pounds. You have to help me, or we are both going to die out here." Cole blinked slowly. The sharp cold seemed to pierce through his confusion for a brief second. He recognized the fierce, determined look on Lena Whitaker's face. He tried to push himself up with his arms. His left arm collapsed instantly. He let out a sharp hiss of pain. His shoulder was dislocated or broken. Lena hooked her arms under his right shoulder. She planted her boots wide in the snow. "On 3, Lena commanded. 1, 2, 3. She pulled with every ounce of strength she had left. Her back screamed, her legs shook. Cole pushed with his good arm and his legs. Together they managed to get him on his feet. He swayed dangerously. He was a full foot taller than Lena, and his weight pressed heavily against her side. She threw his right arm over her shoulders and wrapped her arm tightly around his waist. "Walk," Lena said. They started moving toward the truck. It was only 50 yards away, but it felt like 5 miles. The wind fought them every step of the way. Cole stumbled repeatedly. His heavy boots dragged through the deep snow. Every time he faltered, Lena locked her knees and held him up, refusing to let him fall back down. She could feel his blood soaking through her canvas coat. She could hear his harsh, rattling breath right next to her ear. "Why?" Cole whispered. His head dropped against her shoulder. "Why are you here?" "Because my well is dry," Lena said through gritted teeth. "Keep moving." They reached the truck. Lena pulled open the passenger side door. She practically shoved Cole onto the worn bench seat. He slumped against the window, his eyes rolling back in his head. Lena slammed the door shut. She ran to the driver's side, climbed in, and forced the truck into gear. She did not bother with the water buckets. Surviving was the only priority now. She drove the truck back down the ridge. The heater was still broken. The temperature inside the cab was freezing. Lena kept glancing at Cole. He was unconscious again. The blood from his forehead was dripping down his face and freezing into dark red ice on his jaw. She reached the cabin. She left the truck running and dragged Cole out of the passenger seat. She hauled him up the wooden porch steps and pushed through the front door. The cabin was up to 50 degrees now. It felt like a furnace compared to the storm outside. Lena dropped Cole onto the rug in front of the wood stove. He did not move. Lena sprang into action. She stripped off her wet coat and gloves. She ran to the bathroom and grabbed 3 clean towels and the first aid kit. She ran back to the living room and knelt beside Cole. She had to get his wet, freezing clothes off. She unzipped his ruined leather jacket and pulled it off his shoulders. She unbuttoned his flannel shirt. His chest was covered in dark purple bruises. Whoever had attacked him had used steel pipes or crowbars. Lena worked quickly and efficiently. She was used to treating injured livestock, and the principle was the same. Stop the bleeding, raise the body temperature. check for broken bones. She took a clean towel and pressed it hard against the deep cut on his forehead. Cole flinched, but he did not wake up. The bleeding slowed. Lena cleaned the wound with sharp-smelling antiseptic and taped a thick gauze pad tightly over the cut. She checked his left arm. The shoulder joint was definitely dislocated. It hung at an unnatural, sickening angle. Lena knew she could not set it herself without causing him massive pain, and she did not want him going into shock. She used a triangular bandage to create a tight sling, securing his arm firmly against his chest so it would not move. She pulled the thick wool blanket off the couch and wrapped it tightly around his shivering body. She added 3 more logs to the fire until the cast-iron stove was glowing orange. Lena sat back on her heels. Her breathing was heavy. Her hands were stained with Cole Maddox's blood. She looked at the man lying on her floor. This was the cowboy every woman in town desired. He was supposed to be untouchable. He was supposed to be perfect. But right now, he was just a broken man who owed her his life. The 48-hour countdown was still ticking. Her cattle were still dying of thirst. The bank was still coming for her land. But as Lena watched Cole's chest rise and fall with a steady, strengthening rhythm, she realized that the war had changed. Callahan's men had crossed a line. They had stopped cutting fences and started breaking bones. Lena picked up the bloody towel from the floor. She walked to the kitchen sink and began to scrub the blood off her scarred hands. She was not a victim anymore. The storm was terrible, but she was going to fight back. The brutal Montana winter did not fade away slowly. It surrendered all at once, replaced by a suffocating, blistering early summer heat. It had been 3 months since the blizzard. The deep snow was gone, replaced by cracked, dry earth. The temperature outside the Whitaker cabin was 100 degrees in the shade. The air was so dry, it felt like breathing in hot sand. Lena Whitaker stood next to the main livestock well in the south pasture. The sun beat down relentlessly on her shoulders. Her faded gray T-shirt was soaked with sweat. She held a heavy steel wrench in her right hand, staring at the massive metal casing of the broken pump. She had managed to save her cattle during the winter storm by hauling water from the cave, day after grueling day, until the surface ice finally melted. She had sold off 50 head of cattle in the spring just to make a single payment to the bank, buying herself a temporary delay on the foreclosure. But the well was still a massive problem. The underground water table had dropped permanently. The old pump could not reach the water anymore. She needed a heavy-duty industrial drill rig to bore 100 feet deeper into the rock. Renting a rig cost $15,000. She had exactly $200 to her name. A cloud of yellow dust appeared on the dirt road leading to her pasture. Lena wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm and watched the dust cloud approach. A massive, black, heavy-duty diesel truck pulled up to the fence line. Attached to the back of the truck was a towering steel commercial drill rig. The truck engine shut off. The driver's side door opened. Cole Maddox stepped out. Lena tightened her grip on the steel wrench. She had not seen Cole since the morning after the blizzard. He had woken up on her cabin floor, stared at her with a dark, unreadable expression, and walked out the door without saying a single word of thanks. Cole looked different now. The physical scars from the brutal beating were fully healed, but they left a permanent mark. A thin white scar ran across his forehead, disappearing into his dark hair. The arrogant perfection was gone, replaced by a harsh, dangerous edge. He wore worn blue jeans and a light gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He walked toward Lena with long, steady strides. He stopped 5 feet away from her. He looked at the broken pump, and then he looked directly into her eyes. "Your well is dead," Cole said. His voice was deep and entirely devoid of pity. "I am aware of that," Lena said. Her tone was completely flat. She did not lower the wrench. "You need to go down another 100 feet to hit the new water line," Cole continued. He pointed his thumb back at the massive steel rig attached to his truck. "That rig can punch through the limestone in 6 hours. I will drill the hole. I will drop the new PVC casing. I will install a high-capacity submersible pump. Lena stared at him. She did not blink. I cannot pay you, Lena said. I do not take charity. Not, turn your truck around and get off my property. It is not charity, Cole said. He stepped one pace closer. The heat radiating off his body matched the heat of the sun. It is a business transaction. I need something you have. Lena narrowed her eyes. I have nothing but dry dirt. You have the Eastern Ridge, Cole said. Victor Callahan is not just buying land. He is manipulating the water table. The men who nearly beat me to death in the blizzard were his contractors. They were scouting the old mine entrances on your ridge. That ridge is the highest point in the valley. It oversees my entire property and the main aquifer feed. I need full access to your ridge. I need to set up a permanent observation post up there to watch Callahan's men. You let me use your land, and I fix your well today. Lena processed the offer. It was a cold, pragmatic deal. There was no emotion involved. It was pure survival. She needed water. He needed a tactical advantage. You bring the materials? Lena asked. I have 200 feet of casing and a 5-horsepower pump in the bed of the truck, Cole replied. Fine, Lena said. She lowered the wrench. We have a deal, but I'm not standing around watching you work. I run the winch. Cole looked at her calloused, scarred hands. He gave a single short nod. Back your truck up. We need to clear the area for the drill rig. The next 6 hours were a brutal crucible of physical labor. The temperature climbed to 105 degrees. The air was thick with diesel exhaust and the sharp smell of pulverized limestone. The massive steel drill bit pounded into the earth with a deafening rhythmic crash. Lena operated the heavy mechanical winch, controlling the tension on the steel cables that guided the drill pipe. Her muscles burned. Her hands were covered in thick black grease and gray rock dust. The noise was too loud for conversation. They communicated entirely through gestures and sharp whistles. Cole worked like a machine. He wrestled the heavy 20-foot sections of steel pipe into place, his muscles straining against the immense weight. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his gray shirt completely through. A heavy iron coupling jammed on the drill head. Cole struggled to loosen it with his gloved hands. He stepped back and held his right hand out toward Lena without looking at her. He did not ask for a tool. He just expected her to know what he needed. Lena grabbed the massive 24-inch pipe wrench from the toolbox. It weighed almost 15 pounds. She did not walk it over to him. She swung her arm and tossed the heavy iron tool directly at his chest. Cole caught the heavy wrench smoothly with one hand, never taking his eyes off the jammed coupling. He locked the wrench onto the iron collar, threw his entire body weight against the handle, and broke the jam free. He tossed the wrench onto the dirt without a word and went back to work. It was a small moment, but it shifted something massive between them. There was no hesitation. There was a silent, dangerous rhythm developing. They were two people who understood hard work, and they recognized that same relentless drive in each other. By 3 in the afternoon, the drill finally broke through the hard rock layer. A sudden, powerful rush of cold, clear water shot up from the borehole, spraying 10 feet into the hot air. Lena killed the engine on the drill rig. The sudden silence was ringing in her ears. The water soaked both of them. It was freezing cold and perfectly clean. Lena tipped her head back, letting the water wash the grease and dust from her face. She took a deep breath. It was the best thing she had felt in months. She looked over at Cole. He was standing near the borehole, wiping the water from his eyes. He was looking at her. The cold, distant expression was gone. He was watching the way she stood, the way her shoulders relaxed, the fierce, unyielding strength that kept her standing after 6 hours of brutal labor. Cole walked over to the front of his truck. He grabbed a large, insulated yellow water jug from the front seat. He twisted the cap off and took a long drink. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He walked over to Lena and held the heavy yellow jug out to her. Lena looked at the jug, And then she looked at Cole's face. He was not looking down at her. He was looking at her as an equal. She reached out and took the jug. Their fingers brushed against each other. Cole's skin was rough, hot, and calloused. Lena felt a sudden, sharp jolt of electricity run up her arm, completely unrelated to the cold water. She lifted the jug and drank. The water was icy cold. She lowered the jug and handed it back to him. "The well is deep enough," Lena said. Her voice was steady. "We drop the PVC casing and wire the pump now." "It will take another 2 hours," Cole said. He took the jug from her hand. His dark eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than a normal business partner would. "Let us get it done." They went back to work. The sun began to lower in the sky, turning the dry Montana landscape into a brilliant burning gold. They worked side by side, dropping the heavy plastic pipes down the dark hole, sealing the joints with strong chemical glue, and pulling the thick electrical wires to the surface. They did not speak about the blizzard. They did not speak about the bank or the crushing weight of their debts. They just worked. When the final wire was connected to the control box, Cole stepped back. He gestured to the heavy red power switch on the wooden post. "Your well," Cole said. "You turn it on." Lena walked over to the post. Her hands were shaking slightly from physical exhaustion. She gripped the red handle and slammed it upward. There was a low, powerful hum deep within the earth. A second later, a massive, steady stream of cold water blasted out of the PVC pipe and crashed into the large steel trough. The water was loud, violent, and beautiful. Lena let out a long, shaky breath. The 250 cows in the distance heard the sound of the running water and began to move slowly toward the trough. She turned to look at Cole. He was leaning against the massive tire of his truck, watching the water fill the steel tank. "You can move your gear up to the eastern ridge tomorrow morning," Lena said. "You have full access. Just lock the gate behind you." "I will," Cole said. He pushed himself off the tire and walked toward the driver's side door of his truck. He opened the door, then stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. "You run a good winch, Whitaker," Cole said. It was the highest compliment a man like Cole Maddox could give. "You drill a straight hole, Maddox," Lena replied. Cole gave a small, almost invisible smile. It changed the entire structure of his face, making him look younger and fiercely alive. He climbed into the truck, started the loud diesel engine, and drove away, leaving a trail of yellow dust behind him. Lena stood alone in the fading heat of the day, listening to the sound of the water filling the tank. Her hands were cut and bleeding. Her muscles ached, but the crushing weight of failure had lifted from her chest. She looked at the tire tracks Cole's truck had left in the dirt. She realized that for the first time in 2 years, she was not entirely alone in the war for Red Hollow. Victor Callahan was coming for their land, but he had just made a massive mistake. He had forced 2 of the hardest, most stubborn people in Montana onto the exact same side of the fence. The heat did not break. For 14 straight days, the Montana sun baked the Red Hollow Valley into a hard, cracked shell. The eastern ridge, rising 500 feet above the Whitaker and Maddox ranches, offered a massive tactical advantage. It also offered absolutely no shade. Lena Whitaker drove a heavy steel stake into the dry dirt. She swung a 10-pound sledgehammer in a wide arc. The heavy iron head slammed into the steel stake. The sharp sound echoed across the empty canyon. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, but she did not stop. She raised the hammer and swung again. They were building the observation post. Cole Maddox needed a blind to watch the valley, and Lena needed to make sure Victor Callahan did not set foot on her land. The pragmatic deal had turned into a daily routine of punishing physical labor. Cole was 20 feet away, digging a corner post hole with a heavy steel auger. His gray work shirt was completely soaked with sweat, clinging tightly to the thick muscles of his back and shoulders. He drove the heavy steel blades into the rock-hard earth, twisted the handle with brutal force, and pulled up a pile of dry dirt. They had been working on the ridge for 6 hours. They had spoken exactly 4 sentences to each other. "The wind is picking up from the south," Cole said. He did not look up from the hole. He slammed the auger back down. "It will bring dust, not rain," Lena replied. She swung her hammer one more time. The steel stake hit solid bedrock and stopped moving. Lena dropped the sledgehammer. Her arms were shaking. She wiped her forehead with the back of her leather work glove. She walked over to the back of Cole's truck. They had hauled 4 massive 8x8 treated wooden posts up the steep dirt road. These posts would form the frame of the watchtower. Cole pulled the auger out of the dirt and dropped it. He walked to the truck. He stood next to Lena, looking at the heavy wooden beams. "We need to set the front 2 posts today," Cole said. His chest heaved with heavy, measured breaths. "They weigh 200 pounds each. We lift on 3. Lena nodded. She moved to the far end of the heavy wooden beam. Cole bent down and gripped the front end. His large hands locked onto the rough wood. 1, 2, 3, Cole commanded. They lifted together. The immense weight of the beam drove Lena's boots deeper into the dust. Her shoulder muscles screamed, but she held her end steady. They walked in perfect, silent unison toward the first deep hole Cole had dug. The ground near the edge of the ridge was loose and unstable. As they approached the hole, the dry dirt beneath Lena's left boot suddenly gave way. Her foot slipped forward. The sudden loss of balance sent a violent shock wave through her arms. The heavy wooden beam jerked downward, threatening to crush her collarbone. "Drop it!" Cole shouted. Lena did not drop it. If she let go, the 200-pound beam would snap Cole's wrists. She planted her right boot hard against a solid rock, gritted her teeth, and threw her entire body weight backward to counter the falling wood. Cole moved with terrifying speed. He did not drop his end. He lunged forward, closing the 10 feet between them in 1 second. He shoved his thick shoulder directly under the center of the beam, taking the entire 200 pounds of crushing weight onto his own body. The heavy wood slammed against his collarbone. Cole let out a sharp grunt, but his legs did not buckle. He stood like a pillar of solid stone. "Let go, Whitaker," Cole said. His voice was a low, rough growl right next to her ear. Lena let go of the wood. She stumbled backward, gasping for air. Cole smoothly shifted the massive beam, stepped to the edge of the hole, and dropped the heavy wood straight down. The post hit the bottom of the deep hole with a loud, heavy thud. It stood perfectly straight against the sky. The dust settled. The silence returned to the ridge. Lena stood 2 feet away from Cole. She was breathing hard. Cole turned to look at her. The distance between them was suddenly very small. He was so close she could smell the intense heat radiating off his skin. It was a sharp mix of pine sap, hot dust, and clean sweat. His dark eyes locked onto hers. The usual cold distance in his gaze was completely gone. It was replaced by a fierce, burning intensity that made Lena's heart hammer wildly against her ribs. "I told you to drop it," Cole said. His voice was surprisingly quiet. "If I dropped it, it would have broken your hands," Lena said. She looked up at him. She refused to step back. Cole stared at her. His gaze dropped to her hands. Her leather gloves were torn. The knuckles underneath were bruised and bleeding again. He reached out slowly. He did not ask for permission. His large, calloused fingers gently wrapped around her right wrist. He pulled her hand toward him. The touch was incredibly light, a massive contrast to the brutal strength he had just used to catch the heavy beam. He slowly pulled the torn leather glove off her hand. He looked at the fresh scrapes and the old, deep scars. He traced the edge of a jagged white scar across her palm with his thumb. The calluses on his thumb scraped against her skin, sending a jolt of pure heat straight up her arm. "You do not have to carry the entire world by yourself, Lena," Cole said softly. It was the first time he had ever used her first name. Lena felt a sudden, terrifying tightness in her throat. For 2 years, no one had looked at her like this. No one had seen the exhaustion she hid behind her anger. Everyone in town just saw a stubborn woman holding on to a dying ranch. But Cole Maddox was looking at her like she was the most valuable thing on the entire mountain. "If I do not carry it, it falls," Lena whispered. Cole did not let go of her hand. "Not if I'm standing underneath it." He looked back up into her eyes. The tension between them was thick and heavy, pulling them closer together. Lena felt herself leaning forward. She wanted to close the final 2 inches between them. She wanted to know if his lips were as hard and rough as the rest of him. A loud metallic crash echoed from the valley below. The sharp sound shattered the moment. Cole instantly let go of her hand. He stepped back and turned his head toward the valley. His body went completely rigid. Lena grabbed her glove and stepped up to the edge of the ridge beside him. She looked down into the deep canyon that separated their 2 ranches. A fleet of 5 heavy yellow bulldozers was moving down the county highway. They were accompanied by 3 black armored SUVs. The machines were not agricultural equipment. They were commercial excavators built for tearing deep into the earth. "Callahan," Cole said. The dangerous cold edge returned to his voice. "What is he doing with deep excavators?" Lena asked. "He is buying ranches, not building skyscrapers." "He is not building anything," Cole said. His dark eyes tracked the massive machines as they turned onto a dirt road leading toward the old limestone caves. "He is burying something." Cole turned away from the edge. He walked back to the heavy wooden post they had just dropped into the hole. He grabbed a shovel and started throwing dirt into the hole to secure the base. "Town meeting is tonight at 7, Cole said, shoveling rapidly. "Callahan called it. He claims he has an official report on the drought." "Are you going?" Lena asked. "Yes," Cole said. He stopped shoveling and looked at her. "He is going to use this drought to panic the entire town into selling. He is going to try to isolate you." "Let him try," Lena said. She grabbed a second shovel and started throwing dirt into the hole beside him. They did not speak again for the rest of the afternoon. But the rhythm of their work had changed. They moved in perfect synchronization. The invisible wall between the golden boy of Red Hollow and the fierce, lonely rancher was completely gone. They were 2 soldiers digging a trench, preparing for the exact same war. The Red Hollow Community Center was a large wooden building with a tin roof that trapped the summer heat like an oven. By 7 that evening, the room was packed with over 100 people. Every rancher, farmer, and business owner in the valley had come to hear the news. The air conditioning was broken. The room smelled of nervous sweat, old boots, and stale coffee. People sat on folding metal chairs, fanning themselves with pieces of paper, their faces drawn tight with worry. The drought was killing their livelihoods. Lena Whitaker stood in the back corner of the room. She wore clean blue jeans, a white button-down shirt, and her old leather boots. She kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt a tall, solid presence move into the space directly behind her right shoulder. She did not have to turn around to know it was Cole. She could feel the heat radiating from him. He stood silently, a heavy protective wall between her and the rest of the crowded room. At exactly 7, Victor Callahan walked to the front of the room. Callahan looked entirely out of place in Red Hollow. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored gray suit that probably cost more than Lena's truck. His shoes were polished leather. His hair was perfectly styled. He smiled warmly at the crowd, but his eyes were cold, calculating, and completely dead. He stood behind a wooden podium and adjusted a silver microphone. "Good evening, my friends," Callahan said. His voice was smooth and practiced, designed to project comfort and authority. "I know tensions are high. The heat is brutal. The wells are running dry. You are all worried about your families and your legacies. That is why I asked you to come here tonight." He signaled to a man in the front row. The room lights dimmed. A bright projector clicked on, shining a massive, colorful map onto the white wall behind Callahan. It was a geological cross-section of the Red Hollow Valley. "I hired the best independent hydrological engineers in the state to figure out why our water is disappearing," Callahan said. He pointed a red laser pointer at the screen. The results are, unfortunately, tragic. The crowd went completely silent. This red zone here represents the main underground aquifer, Callahan explained, moving the laser over the map. For 100 years it fed your wells. But the Earth changes. Seismic shifts happen. According to this certified state report, a natural fault line has shifted deep beneath the mountains. The aquifer is draining away. It is not a drought, my friends. It is a permanent geological shift. A loud murmur of panic swept through the metal chairs. Old Arthur Pratt, who owned the dairy farm down the road, stood up. "Are you saying the water is never coming back?" Arthur asked. His voice cracked with fear. "I am saying the water table is dropping 5 feet every week," Callahan said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Within 2 months, every well in this valley will pull pure dust. The land will be completely barren." Lena stared at the projected map. Her eyes narrowed. She looked at the colorful lines representing the limestone caves and the underground rivers. She had spent 10 years inside those exact caves with her grandfather. They had mapped every inch of the subterranean flow. The map on the wall was a lie. "This is why I am here," Callahan continued, raising his hands to calm the panicked crowd. "I am a developer, yes, but I care about this community. I am prepared to offer above-market value for your ranches right now, today. I will buy the dry land. I will take on the massive cost of running 20-mile pipelines from the state reservoir. You can take the cash, pay off your bank debts, and start fresh somewhere safe. Or you can stay here and watch your cattle die of thirst." Callahan paused. His cold eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto Lena in the back corner. "Some of your neighbors are already facing foreclosure," Callahan said. His voice grew slightly louder. "Some people are too proud, or perhaps too stubborn to see reason. Some people are relying on dangerous, bankrupt elements in this town to save them. Do not let foolish pride destroy your families." The entire room turned to look at Lena and Cole. The whispers started instantly. They were looking at Cole like he was a predator, and looking at Lena like she was a naive victim. Lena felt a surge of pure, violent rage in her chest. Callahan was using fear to steal their homes. She turned to Cole. "Watch my back," Lena whispered. "Always," Cole said. Cole. His voice was dark and ready for violence. Lena turned and walked straight out the back door of the community center. She ran to her old Ford truck parked in the dirt lot. She opened the heavy toolbox in the truck bed. Buried under a pile of rusted chains was a heavy canvas bag. Her grandfather had given it to her on his deathbed. Lena opened the bag and pulled out a jagged, cylindrical piece of solid gray rock. It was a core sample. It was 12 inches long, 4 inches thick, and weighed almost 10 pounds. She gripped the heavy rock in her right hand, slammed the toolbox shut, and marched back into the hot, crowded building. Callahan was still talking, passing out thick stacks of purchase contracts to the desperate ranchers in the front row. "If you sign tonight, we can begin the cash transfers by Friday," Callahan promised. "Do not sign a single piece of paper," Lena shouted. Her voice cut through the room like a gunshot. The crowd parted as Lena walked straight down the center aisle. She held her head high. Her boots hit the wooden floor with heavy, purposeful thuds. Cole stepped into the aisle right behind her, matching her pace perfectly. He looked like a massive, terrifying bodyguard. The ranchers quickly stepped out of their way. Lena reached the front of the room. She stood 3 feet away from Victor Callahan. She did not look at his expensive suit. She looked at his dead eyes. She raised the heavy piece of gray rock and slammed it down onto the wooden podium. The loud crash made Callahan jump backward. The silver microphone screeched with a sharp burst of static. "That map is a lie," Lena said. She pointed a scarred finger at the projector screen. "And your certified engineers are frauds." Callahan quickly recovered his smooth smile, but a tight muscle twitched in his jaw. "Miss Whitaker," Callahan said condescendingly, "I understand you are under immense financial stress. The foreclosure on your property is public record. But this is a certified geological report. You are just a rancher. I am the granddaughter of the man who mapped every subterranean cave in this county, Lena shot back. She picked up the heavy core sample and held it up for the room to see. This is a core sample of pure, non-porous basalt, Lena said loudly, projecting her voice to the back of the room. I pulled this from the Eastern Ridge Caves 5 years ago. Look at his map. She pointed to the red zone on Callahan's projection. His map shows the aquifer resting on a bed of porous sandstone, Lena explained. Sandstone allows water to drain away if a fault line shifts, but we do not sit on sandstone. Red Hollow sits on a massive, solid bowl of basalt rock. Water cannot drain through basalt. It is physically impossible for the aquifer to drain downward. The only way the water stops flowing is if someone builds a physical wall to block it upstream. The room went dead silent. The ranchers stared at the rock in Lena's hand and then looked at the map on the wall. They knew rock. They knew dirt. Lena was speaking a language they understood perfectly. She is right, old Arthur Pratt said slowly. I dug a cellar 20 years ago. Hit solid basalt at 15 feet. Broke 3 drill bits trying to get through it. The crowd began to murmur again. But this time the sound was not panic. It was anger. They turned their eyes toward Victor Callahan. Callahan's smooth smile vanished completely. The mask of the friendly corporate savior fell away, revealing the ruthless, cold predator underneath. This is absurd, Callahan sneered. You are going to listen to a desperate woman waving a rock around? A woman who is associating with a violent criminal? He pointed a sharp finger at Cole. Maddox is bankrupt. He is dangerous. He is using her to get to your land. Cole stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He just stood next to Lena, his massive frame radiating pure, quiet menace. If you point that finger at her again, Cole said. His voice was so low it barely carried past the podium, but it was filled with absolute terrifying promise. I will break it off. Callahan slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the angry faces of the townspeople. His plan to cause a panic had failed. Lena Whitaker had just destroyed his carefully constructed lie with one piece of stone. You are making a massive mistake, Callahan said softly to Lena. You have no idea what you are interfering with. The water is gone, Miss Whitaker. And soon your ranch will be too. Callahan gathered his fake reports, signaled to his men in the back of the room, and walked out the side door. The town hall erupted into shouting. People were angry, confused, and demanding answers. But Lena did not stay to answer them. She had made her point. She had put a massive, deadly target directly on her own back. She picked up the heavy core sample. She turned around and walked back up the center aisle. Cole walked right beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. They stepped out of the suffocating heat of the building and into the cool, dark Montana night. Lena walked to her truck and threw the rock into the bed. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by the terrifying reality of what she had just done. She had just declared war on a billionaire with an army of bulldozers. Cole stopped beside her. He looked down at her shaking hands. You just humiliated a very dangerous man in front of the entire county, Cole said quietly in the dark. I know, Lena said. She looked up at the stars, trying to calm her breathing. He is going to come after me. He is going to try to break me. Cole moved closer. The space between them disappeared. He reached out and placed his large, heavy hands on both of her shoulders. The warmth of his touch anchored her directly to the ground. He can try, Cole said, his voice a low, fierce vow in the darkness. But he has to go through me first. Lena looked up into his dark eyes. The walls she had built around her heart for 2 years finally cracked. She was not fighting alone anymore. The cowboy every woman desired had just drawn a line in the dirt, and he had placed himself firmly on her side. The heat wave broke on a Tuesday. It did not break gently. The Montana sky turned a bruised, violent shade of purple. The air grew incredibly heavy, pressing down on the Red Hollow Valley like a thick, wet wool blanket. Lena Whitaker and Cole Maddox were 3 miles up the eastern ridge. They were trying to secure a final stretch of barbed wire before the storm hit. The wind was picking up rapidly. It whipped Lena's hair across her face and kicked up blinding clouds of yellow dust. "Pull it tight," Cole shouted over the rising wind. He was leaning his massive weight against a wooden fence post, holding a heavy metal lever. Lena gripped a specialized wire stretching tool. Her leather gloves were slick with sweat. The thick steel wire was covered in sharp, rusted barbs. She clamped the tool onto the wire and threw her entire body weight backward to create maximum tension. The sky above them cracked open. A massive bolt of lightning struck the peak of the mountain, followed instantly by a deafening roar of thunder. The sudden explosion of sound startled the horses tied nearby. One of the horses reared up, pulling its lead rope hard against the fence line. The sudden shift in tension traveled straight down the wire. Lena felt the heavy steel wire jerk violently in her hands. "Look out!" Cole yelled. The rusted wire snapped under the extreme pressure. It recoiled like a massive steel whip. The broken end slashed directly across Lena's hands, tearing right through her heavy leather work gloves. Lena cried out in pain. She dropped the stretching tool and fell to her knees in the dirt. The rain hit exactly 1 second later. It was not a normal summer shower. It was a torrential, blinding sheet of water. The flash flood warning they had ignored all morning was now a brutal reality. The dry, cracked earth instantly turned into a river of slick, dangerous mud. Cole dropped the metal lever. He ran to Lena and dropped to his knees in the mud beside her. "Let me see," Cole demanded. His voice cut sharply through the heavy rain. Lena held her hands against her chest. Her gloves were sliced open across the palms. Bright red blood was rapidly mixing with the pouring rain, washing down her wrists and dripping onto the muddy ground. The pain was sharp and blinding. Cole did not hesitate. He grabbed her by the shoulders and hauled her to her feet. "The line shack," Cole said. He pointed down the ridge toward a small abandoned wooden building 100 yards away. "Run." They ran through the blinding downpour. The wind pushed them sideways. The mud tried to suck their heavy boots down into the earth. Cole stayed right behind Lena, keeping his large body between her and the worst of the driving rain. Lena kicked the wooden door of the old line shack open. They both stumbled inside, gasping for air. Cole slammed the door shut against the storm, throwing the heavy iron latch into place. The sudden silence inside the shack was heavy. The rain pounded relentlessly on the rusted tin roof, creating a loud, rhythmic drumming sound. The shack was tiny, barely 10 feet by 10 feet. It smelled of old dust, dry mice droppings, and damp wood. The only light came through a small, dirty window facing the valley. Lena leaned against the wooden wall. She was completely soaked. Her clothes clung to her freezing skin. She was shivering violently. But the worst part was the burning agony in her hands. Cole did not say a word. He moved quickly in the dim light. He walked over to an old wooden cabinet in the corner. Line shacks were built 50 years ago for cowboys caught in bad weather. They always kept emergency supplies inside. He pulled open the cabinet doors. He found an old glass bottle of cheap whiskey and a clean, folded white cotton bandana. He walked back to Lena. He stopped exactly 1 foot in front of her. His massive frame seemed to take up the entire room. Water dripped from his dark hair, running down the sharp angles of his jaw. His gray shirt was plastered to his chest, rising and falling heavily as he breathed. "Give me your hands," Cole said. His voice was low, rough, and completely uncompromising. Lena slowly held her hands out. Her fingers were trembling. Cole reached out and gently took her wrists. His touch was incredibly warm against her freezing, wet skin. He did not pull her gloves off roughly. He carefully grasped the torn leather on her left hand and slowly peeled the heavy material away. The cut on her left palm was deep. The rusted wire had sliced through the thick calluses, exposing raw tissue. Cole peeled the right glove off. The right hand was just as bad. Lena winced and tried to pull her hands back. The pain was throbbing with every heartbeat. Cole tightened his grip on her wrists, just enough to keep her from moving. He did not look at her face. He kept his dark eyes focused entirely on her injured palms. "This is going to burn," Cole said quietly. He uncorked the glass bottle with his teeth. He spit the cork onto the wooden floor. He poured the strong amber whiskey directly over the open wounds on her hands. Lena let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The alcohol burned like liquid fire. Her knees buckled slightly. Cole instantly caught her. He dropped the bottle, wrapped his heavy left arm around her waist, and pulled her flush against his solid chest. He held her upright, letting her press her face against his wet shirt while the burning pain peaked. She could feel the rapid, heavy thud of his heart directly against her cheek. He was not calm. He was incredibly tense. The burning slowly faded into a dull, manageable ache. Lena lifted her head. She was still trapped in the tight circle of his arm. Cole looked down at her. His chest was heaving. He slowly reached up with his right hand and wiped a wet strand of hair away from her eyes. His calloused thumb lingered on her cold cheek for exactly 3 seconds. He stepped back, breaking the physical contact. The loss of his body heat made Lena shiver again. Cole picked up the clean white bandana. He carefully folded it into a thick square. He took her left hand again. He pressed the cotton firmly against the bleeding cut. He did not rush. He treated her injured hands with an intense, terrifying level of care. He held her calloused, scarred hands with the dark, heavy reverence of a man holding his entire world. He looked at the deep scars crisscrossing her skin. These were the hands of a woman who had fought for 2 years to keep a dying ranch alive. These were the hands that had swung a 10-pound sledgehammer for him just yesterday. "You never quit," Cole whispered. He kept his eyes on her hands. "I have watched you for 3 years, Lena. You never stop fighting." Lena stared at the top of his dark head. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a bird trapped in a cage. "I cannot afford to quit," Lena said softly. Cole slowly looked up from her hands. His dark eyes met hers. The dim light from the dirty window cast shadows across his face, highlighting the brutal, handsome lines of his jaw and the fierce intensity of his gaze. "You do not have to fight me," Cole said. His voice was a deep rumble that vibrated in the small room. "I am not fighting you," Lena replied. Her voice trembled, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Cole stepped closer. The space between them disappeared again. He reached out and gently cupped the side of her face with his large hand. He leaned his head down. His face was only 2 inches away from hers. She could feel his hot breath on her lips. The tension was suffocating. The air in the tiny shack felt electric, heavier than the thunderstorm raging outside. Lena closed her eyes, waiting for the kiss. She wanted it. She realized, with a sudden wave of terrifying clarity, that she wanted Cole Maddox more than she wanted anything else in the world. A massive, deafening explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet. It was not thunder. The explosion came from deep inside the earth. The violent shockwave hit the wooden shack a second later, rattling the windows and shaking dust from the ceiling. Cole instantly threw his arms around Lena, spinning her around and covering her body with his own as the wooden shack violently shuddered. The explosion echoed through the canyon for 10 long seconds before finally fading away. Cole slowly stepped back. He turned his head and looked out the dirty window toward the valley below. The storm was still raging, but the deep mechanical rumble echoing from the earth had completely stopped. "That was dynamite," Cole said. His voice was suddenly cold and hard. "Commercial grade." Lena moved to the window beside him. "Where did it come from?" "The lower canyon," Cole said. He looked at her. The intense, intimate moment between them was completely shattered, replaced by the grim reality of their war. Callahan just made his next move. The rain stopped just before dawn on Wednesday. The sky cleared, leaving the Red Hollow Valley washed clean and smelling of wet pine. But the beauty of the morning was a complete lie. Lena and Cole rode their horses down the steep ridge path as soon as the sun rose. Lena's hands were tightly bandaged with white cotton, making it difficult to hold the leather reins. They reached the valley floor and rode toward the main riverbed. The Red Hollow Creek was the lifeblood of the entire county. It was fed by the underground aquifer and provided surface water to 15 different ranches downstream. Cole pulled his large black horse to a sudden stop. Lena rode up beside him and stopped her horse. The creek was completely dry. Where a rushing river of cold mountain water had flowed just 24 hours ago, there was now only wet mud, exposed rocks, and hundreds of dead, gasping silver fish. Lena stared at the dry riverbed. A cold knot of pure dread formed in her stomach. "He blew the main subterranean artery," Cole said. His voice was dangerously calm. He stared up at the limestone cliffs where the deep caves were located. Callahan used the thunderstorm to cover the sound of the explosion. He collapsed the underground cave system. He built a dam out of the rubble. He just cut off the water supply for the entire county. "Can he do that?" Lena asked, horror creeping into her voice. "That is a federal crime." "He can do whatever he wants if no one can prove he did it," Cole replied. He pulled his horse around. "We need to get to your cabin. We need to call the state investigators." They rode hard across the wet pastures. They reached Lena's cabin 20 minutes later. But they were too late. There were 4 county sheriff vehicles parked in Lena's muddy front yard. The red and blue emergency lights were flashing brightly in the morning sun. Sheriff Thomas Porter stood on the wooden porch holding a thick stack of official papers. Beside him stood 3 armed deputies. Cole and Lena dismounted. Cole stepped firmly in front of Lena, keeping his large body between her and the police officers. "Sheriff," Cole said loudly, "if you are here about the river, Victor Callahan just blew the underground aquifer." Sheriff Porter did not look happy. He walked down the wooden steps, keeping his hand resting near his heavy black duty belt. "I know about the explosion, Cole," Sheriff Porter said heavily. "The seismic monitors in Helena registered the blast at 4 in the afternoon yesterday. The state investigators are already at the caves." "Then you need to go arrest Callahan," Lena said, stepping out from behind Cole. "Callahan was at a public charity dinner in the city of Billings all of yesterday," Porter said. He stopped 5 feet away from Cole. He looked down at the official papers in his hands. "He has 50 witnesses who will swear he never left the hotel." "He hired contractors," Cole said, his jaw tight. "He pays men to do his dirty work." "Maybe," Porter agreed. "But the state investigators did not find Callahan's fingerprints in the caves. They found a blasting cap and a wooden crate." Porter looked up. He looked directly into Cole's eyes. "The crate had serial numbers," Porter continued. "Those numbers match a purchase of 50 pounds of commercial dynamite made 3 days ago. The purchase was made using a credit card registered to the Maddox Ranch." Lena froze. The air left her lungs. "That is impossible," Lena said. "Cole has been on the ridge with me all week." "Callahan stole my financial data," Cole said. His voice was completely flat. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who finally understood the trap he was standing in. "There is more, Cole," Porter said quietly. He sounded genuinely sorry. "The state auditors pulled your ranch financials this morning. You are bankrupt, Cole. Your accounts have been empty for 6 months. You are over $2 million in debt. The state theory is that you are desperate. They think you blew the aquifer to commit eco-terrorism. They think you are trying to force the state to buy your land for an emergency reservoir project." Lena turned to look at Cole. Her mind was spinning. "Bankrupt?" Lena whispered. "Cole, what is he talking about?" Cole did not look at her. He stared straight ahead at the sheriff. His broad shoulders were tense, locking his body into a rigid wall of stone. "The FBI is taking over the case by noon," Porter said. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "I have a warrant for your arrest, Cole Maddox. You are being charged with domestic terrorism, destruction of a public waterway, and reckless endangerment." "No!" Lena shouted. She stepped forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in her bandaged hands. He did not do it. We were together in the line shack when the explosion happened. I am his alibi. Miss Whitaker, Porter said sternly, if you provide a false alibi for a federal suspect, the FBI will tear your life apart. They will seize this ranch before the sun sets today to look for co-conspirators. Callahan's lawyers are already demanding a full investigation into your property. Cole moved. He turned around and grabbed Lena by the shoulders. His grip was hard and completely unforgiving. He looked down at her. The fierce, burning intensity she had seen in the line shack yesterday was completely gone. His dark eyes were cold, distant, and dead. "Do not say another word, Lena," Cole said. His voice was loud enough for the deputies to hear. "Cole, tell them the truth," Lena pleaded. She grabbed his gray work shirt. "Tell them it was Callahan." "The truth?" Cole said. He let out a harsh, cruel laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. "The truth is that I am broke. My ranch is dead. I have been drowning in debt for a year." He let go of her shoulders and stepped back. He looked at her with pure disdain. "You thought I was helping you?" Cole sneered. "I made a pragmatic deal with a desperate woman because I needed access to your ridge. Your ridge sits directly above the cave system. I used your property to scout the blast zones. I used you, Lena. That is the only reason I ever looked your way." Lena felt like she had been punched in the stomach. The air rushed out of her lungs. She stared at the man standing in front of her. The man who had carefully cleaned her bleeding hands yesterday. The man who had taken the weight of a 200-pound wooden beam to save her collarbone. "You are lying," Lena whispered. Her voice broke. "I am a desperate man, Whitaker," Cole said coldly. "And desperate men do whatever they have to do to survive." He turned his back on her. He walked straight toward Sheriff Porter and held his large hands out. Porter snapped the heavy steel handcuffs over Cole's wrists. The metal clicked loudly in the quiet morning air. "Put him in the back of the cruiser," Porter ordered his deputies. The deputies grabbed Cole by the arms and led him to the police car. They pushed his massive frame into the back seat and slammed the door. Cole did not look out the window. He stared straight ahead at the metal cage dividing the car. "Sheriff," Cole called out before Porter could get into his vehicle. "Miss Whitaker had absolutely nothing to do with this. I used her land without her knowledge. Keep the FBI off her ranch." "I will put it in my official report, Cole," Porter said. He looked at Lena with deep pity. "I am sorry for the trouble, Miss Whitaker. You should stay inside today." The sheriff got into his car. The vehicles turned around in the muddy yard. Lena stood completely still, watching the police cars drive away down the dirt road, taking Cole Maddox away to the county jail. She was entirely alone again. Lena walked slowly up the wooden steps and went inside her quiet, cold cabin. She walked into the kitchen and sat down at the heavy oak table. She looked at her bandaged hands. The white cotton was stained with dried blood. She remembered the heat of Cole's chest. She remembered the terrifying level of care in his eyes. He had lied to the sheriff. He had lied to her. He had confessed to a federal crime to close the investigation instantly. By claiming he acted alone out of financial desperation, he ensured the FBI would not search the Whitaker ranch. He had deliberately made himself the villain to protect her property from being seized as a crime scene. He had sacrificed his freedom, his reputation, and his life just to give her a chance to keep her land. Lena looked at the center of the kitchen table. Sitting right next to her 30-day foreclosure notice was a thick, pristine white envelope. Victor Callahan had sent it by courier early this morning. Lena reached out and opened the envelope. It was a formal buyout contract. Callahan was offering her $100,000 in cash to walk away from Red Hollow today. If she signed it, her debts would be cleared. She could leave this brutal valley forever. It was the dark night of her soul. She had $200 in the bank. Her well was about to run dry again because the aquifer was physically blocked. The only man who had ever stood beside her in a fight was currently locked in a steel cage, facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Lena stared at the signature line on the bottom of Callahan's contract. Callahan had won. He had broken her well. He had broken her neighbor. Now he expected her to break. He expected her to take the money and run like a coward. Lena picked up a black pen. She held it over the thick white paper. Her hand hovered above the signature line. She thought about Cole Maddox sitting in a cold cell, taking the blame for a war he did not start. She thought about her grandfather mapping the caves in the dark. She thought about her father breaking his back to build the barn outside. Lena gripped the black pen tightly. She did not sign the contract. She crossed out Victor Callahan's name with one sharp, violent stroke of black ink. She was Lena Whitaker. She did not run, and she was absolutely going to burn Victor Callahan's entire empire to the ground. Lena Whitaker pushed open the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank in the city of Billings. The air conditioning inside the massive marble building was freezing. It was a sharp contrast to the brutal 90-degree heat baking the pavement outside. Lena did not care about the cold. She walked straight across the polished floor toward the main loan desk. Her heavy leather boots left faint rings of dried mud on the pristine white tiles. The bank tellers in their sharp suits looked up at her stained canvas coat and bandaged hands with obvious distaste. Lena reached the desk of the senior loan officer. A silver nameplate read David Vance. Vance was a man who dealt in high-risk, high-interest agricultural loans. He was known for being completely ruthless. Lena reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a thick, folded piece of heavy yellow parchment paper. She placed it flat on the polished mahogany desk. "I need $100,000 in cash," Lena said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Right now." Miss Vance looked at the bandaged hands resting on his desk, and then he looked down at the paper. He carefully unfolded the heavy yellow document. It was the original land deed to the Whitaker Ranch. It was signed by her grandfather 70 years ago. It was the only thing in the world that Lena truly owned. It was her blood, her history, and her entire identity. "Miss Whitaker," Vance said. He adjusted his glasses. "This property currently has a foreclosure notice from the Red Hollow County Bank. It is scheduled to be seized in less than 20 days. You cannot use it as collateral." "The foreclosure is for a debt of $45,000, Lena replied. She did not blink. "The land itself, 500 acres of prime grazing territory with a newly drilled deep water well, is appraised at over $1 million. I am offering you a first-position mortgage. You pay off the county bank today to clear the title. You give me the remaining $55,000 in a cashier check and $5,000 in physical cash. If I fail to repay you in 6 months at your maximum interest rate, you get a $1 million property for a fraction of the cost." Vance stared at her. He was doing the math in his head. It was a terrible, desperate deal for Lena. It was a massive, highly profitable gamble for the bank. It was the kind of cutthroat transaction Vance loved. "You understand the terms you are proposing?" Vance asked smoothly. "If you default, there are no extensions. We take the land immediately." "I understand perfectly," Lena said. She pushed a black pen across the desk toward him. "Draw up the papers." For 1 hour, Lena sat in the cold office. She signed her name 20 times on thick stacks of legal documents. With every stroke of the pen, she felt a heavy physical weight pressing down on her chest. She was risking the very thing she had sworn to protect. She was handing her father's legacy over to a stranger. But a legacy was useless if the people you loved were locked in a steel cage. Vance handed her a thick white envelope containing $5,000 in $100 bills and a certified cashier check for the rest. Lena took the envelope, turned her back on the loan officer, and walked out of the bank. She did not feel regret. She felt a sharp, dangerous clarity. She drove her old Ford truck to an industrial mining supply yard on the edge of the city. She walked into the dusty office and slapped $2,000 in cash onto the counter. I need 1 crate of commercial-grade dynamite, Lena told the foreman, and 50 feet of waterproof detonation cord. The foreman checked her agricultural blasting license, counted the cash, and loaded a heavy wooden crate into the bed of her truck. Lena covered the wooden crate with a thick canvas tarp. She climbed back into the driver's seat and pointed her truck west, driving fast toward the Red Hollow County Jail. The county jail was a grim, square building made of gray concrete and barred windows. It sat right next to the local courthouse. Lena parked her truck in the gravel lot. She walked inside and approached the heavy bulletproof glass of the front desk. Sheriff Thomas Porter was standing behind the glass, talking to a deputy. He looked up when Lena walked in. His face tightened with worry. "Miss Whitaker," Sheriff Porter said through the intercom speaker, "I told you to stay on your ranch. The state investigators are crawling all over the valley. Victor Callahan is demanding federal charges against Cole." "I am here to post bail," Lena said. She slid the certified cashier check under the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass. Porter picked up the check. His eyes widened when he saw the massive number printed on the paper. "This is $50,000, Porter said in shock. "Lena, where did you get this kind of money?" "That is none of your business, Sheriff," Lena replied. Her voice was cold and hard as iron. "The judge set his bail at $500,000 this morning. That check covers the 10% required for immediate release. Process the paperwork. Let him out." Porter looked from the check to Lena's bandaged hands. He knew exactly what she had done. Everyone in town knew the Whitaker ranch was in trouble. She had sold her soul to buy Cole Maddox out of a cage. Porter sighed heavily. "You are making a massive mistake, Lena," he confessed. "He told us he used you." "Process the paperwork," Lena repeated. She did not step back from the glass. It took 45 minutes of agonizing waiting. Finally, a heavy steel door buzzed loudly and swung open. Cole Maddox walked into the small waiting room. He had been stripped of his belt and his bootlaces. He wore his wrinkled gray work shirt and dusty jeans. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the harsh stubble on his jaw made him look incredibly dangerous. He saw Lena standing in the waiting room. He stopped dead in his tracks. The muscles in his broad shoulders tensed instantly. He walked slowly toward her. He did not look grateful. He looked furious. "What are you doing here?" Cole demanded. His voice was a low, angry rumble. "I paid your bail," Lena said simply. She turned and walked toward the exit doors. "Come on." Cole grabbed her left arm, carefully avoiding her bandaged hand. He spun her around to face him. "I told you to stay away from me," Cole said, his dark eyes blazing with anger. "I told the sheriff I used your land. I confessed to the explosion to keep the FBI off your property. Why did you pull me out?" "Because you are a terrible liar, Cole Maddox," Lena said. She stared fiercely right back into his angry eyes. "You did not use me. You did not blow up the aquifer. You sacrificed yourself so Callahan would not send his men to destroy my cabin while I was sleeping. You tried to be a martyr." "I am bankrupt, Lena," Cole practically shouted. The admission tore out of his chest like a physical wound. "I have exactly $0 to my name. My ranch is dead. I have nothing left to lose. You have a ranch to save. You should have left me in that cell." Lena looked at the massive, powerful man standing in front of her. She saw the absolute desperation hiding behind his anger. He was trying to protect her the only way he knew how, by pushing her away and taking the entire beating himself. "I mortgaged my ranch this morning," Lena said quietly. Cole froze. The anger instantly vanished from his face, replaced by pure, absolute horror. "You did what?" Cole whispered. "I gave the deed to a cutthroat bank in Billings," Lena said. She stepped closer to him. "I took the cash to pay your bail. The Whitaker ranch is gone if I do not pay them back in 6 months." Cole dropped his hand from her arm. He took a step backward, looking at her like she had lost her mind. "Why would you do that?" Cole asked. His voice was shaking. "Why would you throw away everything you fought for?" Because a piece of dirt is not worth letting a good man rot in a concrete box, Lena said. She reached out with her bandaged hand and grabbed the front of his gray work shirt. She pulled him slightly forward, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. "You do not get to make my choices for me, Cole," Lena said fiercely. "You do not get to decide that your life is worth less than my property. You drew a line in the dirt at the town hall. You said you would stand with me. I am holding you to that promise." Cole stared down at her. His chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. He was completely disarmed. The impenetrable wall of stoic perfection he had built around himself for 30 years was entirely shattered by the woman standing in front of him. "Callahan is going to kill us both," Cole said softly. "Let him try," Lena replied. She let go of his shirt. "I have a crate of commercial dynamite in the back of my truck. We are going up to the eastern ridge. We are going to hike down into the old silver mine, and we are going to blow Victor Callahan's dam straight to hell." Cole looked at the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had finally stopped running from the fight. "You drive," Cole said. They walked out of the county jail together, stepping out of the cold, concrete shadows and directly into the blinding Montana sun. The war was no longer about saving a piece of land. It was about destroying the man who had tried to break them. The entrance to the old silver mine was hidden behind a thick wall of dead pine trees on the far side of the eastern ridge. The sun had completely set. The red hollow valley below was swallowed by the deep, heavy blackness of a moonless night. Lena Whitaker clicked on a heavy, waterproof tactical flashlight. The bright white beam cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating the jagged, terrifying mouth of the cave. "The main tunnel drops at a 40-degree angle," Lena said. She slung a heavy coil of thick nylon rope over her shoulder. "The limestone gets incredibly slick near the bottom. Step exactly where I step." Cole Maddox stood beside her in the dark. He carried the heavy wooden crate of dynamite on his right shoulder like it weighed nothing. He held a secondary flashlight in his left hand. "Lead the way," Cole said. They stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped instantly, plunging from the residual summer heat into a damp, freezing 40 degrees. The air smelled of wet rock, old sulfur, and stagnant water. Lena moved with absolute confidence. She had navigated these dangerous tunnels 100 times with her grandfather. She knew the blind drops, the unstable ceilings, and the narrow passages that led to the deep underground river system. They walked in silence for 30 minutes, descending deeper into the earth. The only sounds were the heavy thud of their boots on the wet stone and the steady dripping of water from the cave roof. The tunnel began to widen. The sound of dripping water was replaced by a low, powerful rushing noise. Lena stopped at the edge of a massive underground cavern. She shined her flashlight forward. There it was. Victor Callahan had not just collapsed the cave ceiling. He had paid a professional engineering crew to build a massive 15-foot-high wall of thick steel rebar and quick-drying industrial concrete directly across the main subterranean artery. The dark, freezing water of the aquifer was pooling behind the dam, rising higher by the hour, completely cut off from the red hollow valley above. Cole walked up to the edge of the rushing water. He set the heavy crate of dynamite down on a flat rock. He shined his flashlight across the massive concrete wall. "It is 4 feet thick," Cole said, assessing the structure with a critical eye. He anchored the steel directly into the bedrock on both sides. 50 pounds of dynamite will crack the center, but the water pressure has to do the rest of the work. "Where do we place the charges?" Lena asked. Cole opened the wooden crate. He carefully pulled out the thick, wax-coated sticks of commercial explosive. "We need to pack them into the primary stress points at the base of the wall," Cole said. He looked at the rushing black water. "I have to wade in. The water is freezing. You stay on the dry bank and feed me the detonation cord." "I am not letting you go into that water alone," Lena said immediately. "Lena, listen to me," Cole said. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. His voice was harsh and urgent in the echoing cavern. If this dam blows prematurely, or if the ceiling collapses from the shockwave, millions of gallons of water are going to wash everything in this cave away in 10 seconds. You need to stay near the high tunnel exit. No, Lena said stubbornly. She stepped closer to him. We do this together. Cole dropped the stick of dynamite back into the crate. He reached out and grabbed both of her arms. He did not grip her tightly, but his hold was completely inescapable. He looked down into her eyes. The bright beams of their flashlights reflected off the wet cave walls, illuminating the absolute raw desperation on his face. I am bankrupt, Lena, Cole said. His voice was a harsh whisper that echoed in the dark. Do you understand what that means? I lied to the sheriff, yes, but the money part is true. The Maddox Ranch is dead. The bank has been freezing my accounts for 6 months. I sold my best horses to pay my ranch hands. I have been eating canned beans in a dark house because I cannot afford to pay the electric bill. I am nothing but a giant hollow lie. Lena stared at him. The golden boy of Red Hollow, the cowboy every woman desired, was stripping away his armor piece by piece in the freezing dark. Why did you not tell anyone? Lena asked softly. Why did you not ask for help? Because men like me are not allowed to be weak, Cole said bitterly. Everyone in that valley looks at me to be the strong one. If I fell, the panic would have destroyed the town a year ago. So I stood tall, and I watched everything I owned slowly bleed to death. He slowly moved his hands from her arms to her face. He cupped her cold cheeks with his rough, calloused palms. I watched you fight for 3 years, Lena, Cole whispered. I watched you carry the exact same crushing weight, and I was terrified of you. I was terrified because you were so incredibly strong, and I knew I had absolutely nothing left to offer you. I am a broken man with a dead legacy. If I die in this cave tonight, I lose nothing. But you still have a chance. You have to stay safe. Lena felt hot tears prick her eyes. The sheer, overwhelming vulnerability of this massive, dangerous man broke her heart completely open. He had risked everything, including his freedom, for a woman he thought he was not good enough to touch. Lena reached up. She placed her bandaged hands directly over his large hands resting on her face. You stupid, stubborn cowboy, Lena said. Her voice was thick with emotion, but it was fiercely strong. She stepped completely into his space, pressing her chest against his. You think a bank account makes you a man? Lena demanded. You took a 200-pound wooden beam to the shoulder to save me. You fought 4 armed men in a blizzard to protect my land. You offered to spend 20 years in a federal prison just to keep the FBI away from my front door. You have offered me everything that actually matters. Cole stared down at her, his breath catching in his throat. I do not care about your bank accounts, Cole Maddox, Lena vowed. I care about the man who held my bleeding hands in a dirty lined shack. We are blowing this dam together, and we are walking out of this cave together. Cole closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. A long, heavy breath shuddered through his massive chest. The crushing weight of 3 years of solitary loneliness completely shattered. He opened his eyes. The terrifying cold distance was gone forever. It was replaced by a fierce, burning love that took Lena's breath away. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle, polite kiss. It was hard, desperate, and consuming. Cole wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the wet stone floor, pulling her flush against his body. Lena threw her arms around his neck, kissing him back with every ounce of fierce passion she possessed. The kiss tasted of adrenaline, salt, and absolute truth. Cole finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. They were both breathing hard. We blow the dam, Cole said roughly. Together! They moved fast. They waded into the freezing black water, ignoring the numbing cold that instantly soaked through their boots and jeans. Cole wedged the heavy sticks of dynamite deep into the base of the concrete wall. focusing on the main stress fractures. Lena carefully unspooled the thick yellow detonation cord, linking the explosive charges in a perfect, continuous chain. They ran the final 50 feet of cord back up the steep, dry incline of the escape tunnel. Cole connected the yellow cord to a small, heavy mechanical detonator box. He looked at Lena. They were both shivering violently from the freezing water. "Get behind me," Cole ordered. He pushed Lena firmly behind his broad back, shielding her body from the direct line of sight to the massive concrete wall. "Cover your ears and open your mouth," Cole shouted. 1, 2, 3. Cole slammed the heavy metal plunger down. The explosion was apocalyptic. The deafening roar was magnified 100 times by the enclosed cavern walls. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall of solid iron. The ground beneath their feet violently convulsed. A massive, blinding flash of orange fire illuminated the entire cavern for a split second, followed instantly by absolute darkness as their flashlights were knocked to the floor. Then came the sound of the water. The concrete dam shattered. Millions of gallons of highly pressurized, freezing water exploded forward with the force of a freight train. The wall of water hit the cavern walls, churning and roaring as it instantly flooded the lower chamber. The violent backwash surged up the steep incline toward them. "Run!" Cole roared in the dark. He grabbed Lena's arm, practically lifting her off her feet as they scrambled up the steep, slick rock of the escape tunnel. The freezing water chased them, violently clawing at their boots. The entire cave system groaned and shuddered as the massive subterranean river reclaimed its ancient natural path. They ran blindly through the absolute dark. The noise was terrifying. Rocks fell from the ceiling, splashing violently into the raging water below them. After 10 agonizing minutes of climbing, the sound of the rushing water began to fade below them. They saw a faint gray sliver of early morning light shining through the cave exit ahead. They burst out of the cave mouth and collapsed onto the wet, muddy pine needles of the eastern ridge. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Montana mountains. The sky was painted in brilliant, bleeding streaks of gold and crimson. Lena lay on her back, gasping for air. Her lungs burned. Her clothes were heavy with freezing mud. Her body ached in 100 different places. She turned her head. Cole was lying next to her. His chest was heaving violently. His gray shirt was torn and covered in black cave mud. He looked completely ruined. He looked incredibly beautiful. Cole rolled onto his side. He reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the front of Lena's muddy jacket. He pulled her firmly against his chest, wrapping his arms around her in a desperate, crushing grip. He buried his face in her wet hair, breathing in the scent of her skin like it was oxygen. Lena wrapped her arms tightly around his broad back. She held on to him with the fierce, unyielding strength of a woman who had finally found exactly what she was fighting for. "We did it," Lena whispered against his neck. Far below them in the red, hollow valley, the dry riverbed suddenly exploded with life. The cold, clear mountain water rushed back into the creek, filling the banks, overflowing into the dry pastures, and bringing the dead valley back from the brink of destruction. Cole pulled back slightly. He looked down into Lena's muddy, beautiful face. The sun hit his dark eyes, lighting a fire in them that would never go out. "Callahan is going to prison," Cole said. His voice was rough with emotion. "And I am a broke man, Lena. I have nothing but a heavy truck and a lot of debt." Lena smiled. It was a fierce, radiant smile that wiped away 3 years of exhaustion and pain. She reached up and grabbed the collar of his shirt. "I have 500 acres, a new well, and a lot of fencing that needs repairing," Lena said softly. She pulled his face down toward hers. "You are never fighting alone again, Cole Maddox. That is a promise." Cole kissed her under the rising Montana sun. The war for Red Hollow was finally over. The true legacy of the valley was not the dirt, and it was not the water. It was the fierce, unbroken bond between a man who risked everything he had and the woman who chose to stand beside him forever. The sound of the rushing water woke the entire town of Red Hollow. It was 6 in the morning. The deep, powerful roar of the underground river breaking through the surface and filling the dry creek bed echoed off the limestone cliffs. People stepped out onto their wooden porches in the early dawn light. They watched in absolute awe as millions of gallons of cold, clear mountain water flooded back into the dying valley. By 8 in the morning, a massive convoy of state police vehicles and black SUVs rolled down the dirt road toward the eastern ridge. State investigator Clara Vance stepped out of her vehicle. She wore a sharp black suit and heavy boots. She walked to the muddy bank of the swollen creek. Sheriff Thomas Porter stood right beside her. They looked down at the churning water. Massive chunks of shattered industrial concrete and twisted steel rebar were washing downstream, violently tumbling against the natural river rocks. "This is not a natural rock slide, Sheriff," Vance said. Her voice was sharp and clinical. "This is a commercial dam. Someone deliberately starved this county." Cole Maddox and Lena Whitaker walked slowly down the muddy embankment. They were completely exhausted. Their clothes were torn and covered in thick black cave mud. They had walked 5 miles back to the cabin after the explosion, but they stood incredibly tall. Cole kept his right hand resting firmly on the small of Lena's back. Lena reached into her deep coat pocket. She pulled out a small, waterproof digital camera. "We took pictures of the dam before we placed the explosives," Lena said. She handed the heavy plastic camera to Investigator Vance. The concrete forms were stamped with Victor Callahan's corporate logo. "We also found a steel supply box near the base of the wall. It contained the exact same type of commercial dynamite that was used to frame Cole." Vance took the camera. She turned it on and clicked through the digital images. Her eyes widened as she looked at the undeniable physical proof of a massive, illegal subterranean dam. Vance looked up at Cole. "Callahan filed domestic terrorism charges against you yesterday, Maddox. He claimed you blew the aquifer. Based on this physical evidence, I am officially dropping all state charges against you." "Thank you, Investigator," Cole said quietly. "Do not thank me yet," Vance replied. She turned to Sheriff Porter. "Sheriff, secure this entire river as a state crime scene. Gather those pieces of stamped concrete. I'm going to Billings. Victor Callahan has a lot to answer for." At exactly 12 noon, a team of 10 heavily armed state police officers kicked down the heavy oak door of Victor Callahan's luxury hotel suite in the city of Billings. Callahan was standing by a massive glass window drinking a glass of expensive bourbon. He wore a perfectly tailored silk suit. He turned around, his face twisting in sudden, violent shock as the officers swarmed the room. "Victor Callahan," Investigator Vance said loudly, stepping through the broken doorway. "You are under arrest for environmental sabotage, corporate fraud, destruction of public waterways, and attempted murder." "This is insane," Callahan shouted. He dropped his glass. The expensive bourbon spilled across the pristine white carpet. "You have absolutely no proof. I was in this hotel all day." "We have the concrete from your illegal dam," Vance said coldly. "We have the bank records tracing the explosives. And we have 2 very angry ranchers who survived your little cave-in. Put your hands behind your back." The police officers slammed Callahan against the glass window. They pulled his arms back and locked heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The cold, calculating corporate baron was completely powerless. His empire of stolen land and hoarded water was dead. "You are going to spend the next 20 years in the state penitentiary, Callahan," Vance said. "Take him away." The arrest of Victor Callahan made national news. Over the next 6 months, the state courts completely dismantled his corrupt corporation. Every fraudulent land contract in Red Hollow was officially voided. The ranchers got their properties back. The bank loans were investigated and restructured. The suffocating heat of the summer gave way to a crisp, beautiful Montana autumn. The Whitaker Ranch and the Maddox Ranch were no longer separated by a broken fence line. Cole and Lena had spent 4 straight weeks tearing down the old barbed wire. They joined their 500-acre properties into a single, massive expanse of prime grazing land. They took the $55,000 loan Lena had secured, and they used it together. They bought new equipment, high-quality winter feed, and repaired the deep wells on Cole's property. They worked 18 hours a day, side by side, pulling both ranches back from the absolute edge of bankruptcy. On a bright Saturday afternoon in late October, The entire town of Red Hollow gathered in the front yard of Lena's cabin. The ruined hay barn from the winter blizzard was completely rebuilt. The new 8x8 wooden beams smelled of fresh pine and hard work. Golden autumn sunlight filtered through the wide, open barn doors, illuminating the dust dancing in the cool air. Lena Whitaker stood in the center of the new barn. She did not wear a traditional white silk gown. She wore a simple, beautiful ivory cotton dress that fell to her knees. She wore her favorite, well-oiled leather riding boots. Her dark hair fell softly over her shoulders. The deep, jagged scars on her hands were fully visible, and she did not try to hide them. Cole Maddox stood 10 feet away, waiting for her. He wore a clean black suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silver bolo tie. The harsh, dangerous edge that used to define his handsome face was completely gone. As he watched Lena walk toward him, his dark eyes were filled with absolute, overwhelming devotion. Old Arthur Pratt sat on a wooden barrel, playing a slow, acoustic melody on his old guitar. Sheriff Thomas Porter stood in the front row of the crowd, smiling widely and holding his cowboy hat over his chest. Lena reached the front of the barn. She reached out and took Cole's large hands. His calloused fingers gently and reverently traced the faded scars on her knuckles. The local judge stepped forward to officiate the ceremony. He asked them to speak their vows. "You saved my life, Cole Maddox," Lena said clearly. Her steady voice echoed in the quiet, crowded barn. "You stepped into the freezing storm when the rest of the world walked away. You fought for me when I pushed you away. You taught me that I do not have to carry the sky all by myself. I choose you as my partner, my equal, and my husband for all the days I have left." Cole squeezed her hands. He looked down at her with a love so fierce it made the air in the room feel heavy. "You gave me a reason to fight, Lena," Cole said. His deep voice rumbled with raw emotion. "You looked at a broke, desperate man and saw someone worth standing beside. You risked your entire legacy to pull me out of the dark. I will protect this land, and I will protect your heart for the rest of my life." The judge smiled. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Cole did not hesitate. He wrapped his massive arms around Lena's waist and pulled her flush against his chest. He leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was deep, fiercely protective, and completely full of hope. The crowd of ranchers erupted into loud, joyful cheering. Arthur Pratt played his guitar faster. People threw handfuls of yellow autumn leaves into the air. They were celebrating a beautiful wedding, but they were also celebrating the survival and rebirth of their entire valley. Epilogue. 10 years later. The Montana sun was slowly setting over the jagged western mountains, painting the massive sky in deep shades of violet and burning orange. Cole and Lena sat side by side on the wide wooden porch of their newly built combined super ranch. The air was cool and smelled of sweet prairie grass and fresh evening rain. Lena leaned her head against Cole's broad shoulder. Her face was weather-beaten by a decade of harsh winters and brutal summers, but she radiated a quiet, unshakable strength. Cole wrapped his heavy, muscular arm around her waist, pulling her comfortably close against his side. The silver hairs at his temples only made him look more distinguished and grounded. Out in the sprawling green pasture, their 2 children, an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl, were riding fast quarter horses. The children were laughing loudly, expertly moving a small herd of healthy, fat black cattle toward the deep, clear water of the Red Hollow Creek. The ranch was thriving perfectly. The massive $55,000 bank debt was fully paid off 5 years ago. The underground aquifer flowed stronger than ever, feeding the rich land and the people who had fought so incredibly hard to keep it. The brutal Montana wilderness could not break them. Instead, it had taught them the ultimate lesson of survival. True independence was not the stubborn, lonely refusal to lean on someone else. True independence was having the fierce courage to hand your greatest weaknesses to the exact right person, knowing they would gladly help you carry the crushing weight of the entire world. Cole looked down at the beautiful woman resting against his chest. He reached over and took her right hand. His calloused thumb gently traced the faded white scars on her knuckles. Lena looked out at the rolling green hills and her children riding in the golden light. For the first time in her life, the massive land stretching out before her was not a solitary burden to bear, but a wild, beautiful legacy they had chosen together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.